There it is. It's coming right there.
I got him. I got it.
It's coming. There it is. Big one right there.
Got it, bitch.
Hello everyone, I'm here today with Felix Rex, also known of course as Black Pigeon Speaks, and he has very kindly allowed me to come and interview him. So hello Felix, how are you doing?
I'm doing very, very well. How about yourself?
I'm very well. This is the first time that we've spoken actually, is it not?
That is correct.
Yeah, so first things first, how's your time in London going?
Well, my time has been very, very interesting. And I should say for the viewers that aren't aware, I have been in the UK for several months. And previous to that, I was in continental Europe, specifically in France and in Germany, before arriving in the United Kingdom. And what I would say is that the United Kingdom right now is very, 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 very different, not only in the cultural aspects that the country is enacting, but also in the way society is allowing itself to proceed, especially given the tremendous and, I guess, unprecedented circumstances over the last year and a half.
That's a very careful way of putting it. I appreciate that. Well, given that I think maybe everybody has a little corona fatigue, I've heard that you're a bit of an alien buff. Is that correct?
I am a little bit of an alien buff in the sense that I do think that the United States should close its borders to caravans of aliens coming up from Central America. And I don't think that it's basically a problem of ability, but one of will. But if we're talking about other sorts of aliens, as in the extraterrestrial type, well, yes, I find the topic very interesting. And I think, as you were saying, a lot of people have COVID fatigue. And I think having COVID fatigue, I'd like to, for example, I think we talked about taking this interview or this conversation in a different direction. Mm-hmm. And you're going right in.
Well, we wanted to talk about something a bit different, and I know that you've mentioned being a fan of Graham Hancock, who I'm also quite interested in. So let's just dive straight in. Why don't you tell me what you think of the Tic Tac incident?
Okay, well, we can get to the Tic Tac, but you brought up Graham Hancock first, so I'll take this in multiple parts.
All right.
Now, for viewers that aren't familiar with Graham Hancock is a journalist, and I believe he worked at The Economist in the 1980s, and after that he wrote a book called Fingerprints of the Gods and subsequent books on other topics, one of them being psychedelics, but that's for another conversation. But Graham Hancock, he basically teamed up with several different, let's say, revisionist scholars that believe that the orthodoxy in Egyptology is not only wrong, but it's deceptive. Two of those scholars were Anthony West, and the other was geologist Robert Schoch. And they found a lot of anomalous historical... I'm trying to explain what they don't believe, basically, the historical orthodoxy about ancient Egyptian civilization based on a lot of anomalies that they found within the historical record. There are there's hundreds and hundreds of different sort of instances and just big question marks based on Orthodox Egyptology. And they pertain to everything from water erosion around the trench that's built around the Sphinx. And one of the things is I have been to Egypt several times, and before I went to Egypt, even the first time, I had read his book, Fingerprints of the Gods. And Graham Hancock postulates that there was a pre-flood high civilization that basically has been memory holed by us, the current inhabitants, the civilized inhabitants of the world, and that they had not only technology, but also beliefs, and this span of human history is much, much longer than is currently taught as an orthodox concept. And Graham Hancock, he has very, very interesting ideas, and I think not only if you're not interested in reading a big, thick book the size of the Bible, I believe that he serialized his book in compact form on the History Channel, or maybe the Arts and Entertainment Channel back in the early 2000s. And I'm not saying you can find it on the internet without going to Amazon, Netflix, or any of the other wonderful subscription streaming channels, but it is findable. And I would suggest your listeners might want to, maybe just give him a listen and listen in an open mind. As well, as I said, John Anthony West, who unfortunately, as I understand, he passed away in the last couple of years.
So just for clarity, am I right in thinking you would refer to Graham Hancock? I don't know whether revisionist is too undermining a title, but he has a contentious relationship with the old guard archaeologists, who consider many of his claims laughable, although in recent years has come to garner a considerable lot more respect. Is that correct?
Yeah, I would say that. I think part of the reason why is that whenever you attack an orthodoxy, you're attacking not only people's entire lived careers and everything that their lives have come to that point where they've spent their lives in training. They've, especially given Egyptology, they've spent their lives on digs, they've spent their lives reading hieroglyphs, and it's almost as though they've had their conclusion before they actually look at the evidence. So it's putting the horse before the cart. And a very good example of this would be the well-propagandized, and I'm not using that word lightly, that's probably not the right term, the espoused belief that the Great Pyramid in Egypt, the Great Pyramid, which is still to this day called the Great Pyramid of Khufu, and Khufu was an Old Kingdom pharaoh.
Are we talking about Giza?
Yes, we are talking about Giza. We're talking about the Great Pyramid of Giza. And the thing to understand about the Great Pyramid of Giza is that, but one thing that anyone who visits Egypt will notice is that every temple, every palace, any piece of stone slab in that entire country is completely covered with hieroglyphs, not only explaining what things were about, but who built it. And when you go inside what is the largest structure ever constructed by human beings, and it was also the largest and the tallest structure, it still is the largest structure, but it was the tallest structure until the Eiffel Tower was built in the 1880s. It was only surpassed by humans supposedly 4,000 years later. Within the chambers of the pyramids, there is absolutely nothing. The walls are bare. There's not a single hieroglyph. There's not a single painting. There's not a single inscription that says, "I built this." And what you have to understand is that in Egypt, especially in Pharaonic Egypt, in all of the three kingdoms, the Old Kingdom, the Middle Kingdom, and the New Kingdom, when people would build large structures, the pharaoh that built them was very keen to put his stamp on it and say, "I built this." If you haven't been to Egypt, you can even see this in Rome. One of the best preserved buildings from the beginning, from the late Republic, but beginning of the Empire, during the reign of Augustus, is the Pantheon. And the Pantheon was built by Marcus Agrippa, who was not only Octavian Caesar, or better known as Augustus, but he was the general, one of his most loyal, and I guess pretty much on the battlefield, one of his most experienced generals. He built the Pantheon, and all it says on the front of it is Marcus Agrippa built this. So building structures in the ancient world was a very, very common thing to express ownership over what you built.
This is what you mean by a cartouche, like a kind of signature.
Yeah, well, this is where we're going back to the Great Pyramid. Is that the only stamp or evidence of any sort that this was built by an Egyptian pharaoh was found by an Egyptian Egyptologist. And now when I use the word Egyptologist, I use that very loosely because it's before the entire discipline was created, or when there were any standards. So this particular individual, and his name escapes me at the moment, but he was famous for using dynamite to try to blast into the pyramid and find things. So he just dynamited the pyramid all over the place. And his money and his funding was running out. And once he was able to blast his way into the Grand Gallery and then all the way up to the King's Chamber and the Queen's Chamber, what he found was a completely empty pyramid with the only thing they found was a cracked sarcophagi. And And calling it a sarcophagi is to lead into the idea that Egyptologists and their assumption that this was a burial chamber or a tomb of a pharaoh is somewhat misleading. But in the antechambers above the king's chamber, there are relieving blocks that take stress off of the open chamber as the pyramid, just taking the weight off of it. And he blew his way up there as well, and he found basically a painted inscription of a cartouche, as you just said, of the pharaoh Khufu. And what was interesting, his funding was renewed because, well, he found out he was able to solve the great mystery. What is the pyramid? The only problem is in subsequent years, when people now take a look at that inscription and the cartouche, it looks as though it was, let's just say, misspelt for lack of a better term, and that the possibility of it being a forgery by this individual in order to maintain his funding is not only highly probable, but almost invariably true.
He didn't do it with a Sharpie, did he?
No, he didn't do it with a Sharpie, but it probably might as well have been done with a Sharpie.
Interesting.
Yeah.
What would you say to someone who asked if they'd not simply been looted?
Well, no, it's not only being looted. It's not the fact that they've been looted. It's that the walls are utterly bare. So now you brought up the idea of the Valley of the Kings. Now, the Valley of the Kings is, for those of you who aren't aware, it's halfway down what is modern Egypt in the modern town of Luxor. It's actually not in Luxor. So in Egypt, you had the city of the dead and the city of the living. And it depended on which side the sun rose and set, obviously. The sun doesn't set in the east, the sun sets in the west. Therefore, the western bank of the Nile River in modern-day Luxor is where the Valley of the Kings are, in the side of the dead. And it wasn't called Luxor. It was actually on the opposite side of that was the largest religious structure ever built by human beings, and it's called Karnak, and it was continuously in being built for thousands of years. Every pharaoh that came to power would add his portion at his mark, building great structures not only for Egyptians but also for Greeks, for Romans, for almost any large and storied human civilization. Was something that leaders did, and they like to press their stamp on it. What I'm saying is about the Great Pyramids is not only would they might have been looted, but there's nothing on the walls. There's no inscription of any kind anywhere in the biggest building ever created by human or built by human beings on this planet. There's not a single, Kilroy. There's nothing. There's absolutely nothing inside of that structure to say anything about its original purpose, who built it, why it was built. There's absolutely nothing. So if we're going back to the Valley of the Kings and the tombs in Luxor, all of those tombs were unmistakably tombs because they had large hieroglyphic reliefs that not only explained who the pharaoh was, but also the rituals he would need from the Egyptian Book of the Dead to cross over into the next life. And again, with the Great Pyramids, there was nothing. Yeah. So
you said about Karnak, it's impossible to understate how covered every square inch really of the walls are with
the walls,
reliefs.
the pillars, the walls, the pillars, the entirety of the edifice,
even
everything.
Graffiti from later travelers,
Exactly,
I believe, which is quite
exactly.
interesting.
Roman travelers, Greek travelers, French travelers, British travelers, everybody.
What about the fact that they're aligned with the stars?
Well, this is another thing that you're getting at, and that's true, is that there are certain alignments. It depends on our planet. So our planet actually, we perceive it as rotating, and it rotates every 24 hours, and we go across our elliptical orbit around the sun every 365.00 days. And the thing about that is because we see these very minute changes in things over several lifespans, what is not necessarily visible unless you are tracking something for a very long time is something called precession. Now, the way I would try to describe this is that precession is like a top. You spin the top and it rotates up, it rotates to the left, it rotates to the right as it's spinning. Now, our planet does this. It has a full precessional shift every 26,000 years. And the way precession is basically understood on our planet, if you were an observer, is the last constellation in the zodiac appearing before the rise of the sun. Now, over long periods of time, that changes because of the wobble of our planet. So every 2,000 or so years, 2,000, maybe a couple hundred years, maybe not even that if I'm doing the math, the house of the precession changes. So, for example, a lot of you might know the symbol of Jesus is the fish. And the reason is because the last shift in the houses of the zodiac in precession was Pisces. And now a lot of people understand the coming of the dawn of Aquarius. And that is because very soon the constellation of Aquarius is going to be the last zodiac constellation that rises before the rising sun. Now, in order to understand these sorts of things, you would have to understand precession. Now, either you'd have some kind of technology that would be able to do that, or you'd have to be observing these things for a very, 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 very long time. And this alignment of stars is very much baked into a lot of the aspects of the Giza Plateau. And if you're going to look at something like the Great Sphinx, this goes back to the scholars I was speaking about before, Robert Schoch, who's a geologist. If you go to where the Great Sphinx is, and this is actually true, and it's actually kind of depressing, they talk about the eternal gaze of the Great Sphinx. Actually, what the Great Sphinx looks at now is a car park with a KFC and a Pizza Hut in it, and I'm not making that up. But if you look the other way, you can see the Great Sphinx. He's built into a trench. His body, the lion aspect of his body is built into a trench. And that trench shows not only subtle, but total erosion that could only be caused by water. And there hasn't been water on any scale or any amount, whether it be rain or any other type of liquid or any other water, that has been on the Giza Plateau since at least the end of the last ice age, which would then suggest that this carving, this statue, the Sphinx, was built prior to the last great ice age and the deglaciation of these things. And what makes it more interesting is if you take it back to that time, which is about 10,000 years, the Great Sphinx would be staring directly at the constellation of Leo. And a lot of now people that take a look at Egyptian astroarchaeology, I think they believe they call it, would then posit the idea that the pharaonic face on top of the Sphinx was most likely not only not original, was probably a lion head that was there previously, was probably then replaced by a megalomaniacal pharaoh that wanted to put his head on what was probably as unknown to the pharaonic Egyptians who built it as the pyramids are to us today, who built these things. So it's almost as though they were as much in the dark about these edifices and these statues as we are today. There's also another large-scale temple right to the, well, depending if you're looking at the Sphinx to the left, called the Osirian. And they have some of the largest granite blocks ever moved on the planet. And I think I was kind of talking about this to somebody else recently, that there's only 3 land-based cranes, and it would take months of preparation to move one of these blocks.
Where do the blocks come from? The granite? Is it?
Well, they believe that it might. They believe that these things were basically quarried in Abu Simbel, which is pretty much
considerably far from Cairo.
Yeah, it's very far. It's at the bottom of what is modern day Egypt.
Mm-hmm.
So just to put that into perspective, all the way down the Nile, they were carved, they were dressed, and they were supposedly put on a felucca down the Nile when people were still using copper chisels. So, and if people are, you can also see these great megalith structures in Baalbek in the Lebanon, and you can see them even in the UK with Stonehenge. So there was some kind of civilization that existed prior to what we believe to be the beginnings of what is recorded history. Something was here before, and they were moving massive megaliths all over the planet. We don't know who they were, we don't know where they came from, and we don't know where they went. And we don't know how they did any of this. But because we have orthodoxies, any sort of questioning of those orthodoxies, as Graham Hancock has done, as many different people have done, is almost invariably met with ridicule and met with derision, because to question an orthodoxy is not only to question the idea, but it's to dismantle an entire worldview that's been built up over a long period of time. And I think this is why we're seeing this not only in, for example, Egyptology, but I mean, we could go into other areas of orthodoxies. But yeah, I think this is a lot of the reason why we're seeing.
Would you say a lot of this actually comes down to really just brute snobbery and academic prestige that is likely to write off the observations of a quote-unquote mere journalist?
I think that's part of it. I think that's a huge part of it. And I think the snobbery is also built on fear, because to unravel the orthodoxy would then make every book they've written, every speech they've given, every conference, every lecture, every TV interview, if you unravel the orthodoxy of academia and these things that they present as truth, what you're going to do is not only unravel the orthodoxy, but the careers, livelihoods, and prestige, and the snobbery that has been inculcated by these different departments. We can talk about this in various strains of academic thought, but I would say yes, because a lot of our academic credentialism that we have today is built on premises that aren't sound. And I think a lot of people are starting to understand this, especially when we're living in a time where we're told that mathematics now is a form of oppression when you say 2 + 2 = 4, because that's a form of mental colonialism, that there is one right answer in mathematics. We are literally living in a time where madness is taken as truth. Emotionalism is taken as fact. And orthodoxies are unapproachable in many, especially in the social sciences, but now entering the hard sciences as well. So yeah.
How do we get onto aliens from here then?
How do we get onto aliens? Well, one thing is that Graham Hancock has never postulated or even suggested that aliens are responsible for this prehistoric culture of megalith builders or anything in that sort. I think what we were kind of talking about previously was more a completely divergent conversation, and I think that should be set out clearly insofar as Graham Hancock and his thoughts. He's never suggested they are.
No, he's not, but I am.
You mean, could it be aliens?
I didn't mean E.T.
It might be aliens.
Well, I suppose this maybe would bring us on to the Tic Tac incident and the supposed potential underwater dwellings of unidentified aircraft.
Mm-hmm. What you're talking about is basically U.S. Navy disclosure on unidentified flying objects that are in our airspace that they cannot explain, and they've said themselves are in a technological league hundreds and hundreds of years, if not more, ahead of ourselves. Now, I actually should tell you, as I went to a kind of an interesting day-long panel and session at what is called the British Asiatic Society near Euston Station here in London, and it was a day-long series of lectures on multiple things, and they were talking a lot about these ideas, and there was a few of these people. I'll tell you the truth. Like, I was with them for half of their lecture, and then they would just go right off the rails on things like, changing timelines or talking to mediums with crystal balls and whatnot. But there was a few people that were trying to suggest that the Tic Tacs are actually terrestrial creatures living within what they believe the hollow Earth, and that not only is there a hole on the North Pole, but a hole on the South Pole, and that there's an internal sun and there's a whole nother universe within the planet. Maybe that's true. I've not really seen anything that would convince me of that, but the Tic Tacs are quite interesting in the sense that it's something that is now being acknowledged by the United States government and the United States military. Now, whether or not that is being used for real alien disclosure or being used for misinformation, as they've done since the Roswell incident, there's been so much misinformation pumped out and so much attempts at basically using the left hand to distract from what the right hand is doing. It's hard to say. But these things do appear to be real, and they do appear to be something that is not at least something that we can understand as being terrestrial. I won't go as far as to say that they are extraterrestrial because I myself can't make that determination, but it is something that I think if even 2% of the story was real, it's the biggest story in human history, and something that people should maybe try to distract themselves from their soccer games and their basketball games and their Netflix and their other distractions of bread and circus to pay attention to. Whether or not you're ever going to get full alien disclosure is another question, though.
Well, I should say the place this all started in our conversation was a discussion of the moon.
Yeah.
And you told me that there are irregularities or peculiarities, and this got us on to discussing China's little robot, what you would call him, little rover.
A rover.
That appears to have spent a very long amount of time on the dark side. Is that correct?
Well, he hasn't spent a lot of time on the dark side. He's been on the dark side the entire time. Now,
interesting.
Yeah, the moon has so many anomalous features as we could probably have a 5-hour discussion on this. The Chinese had sent up, in the last several years, I believe it was about 2 years ago, they sent up an orbital satellite that orbits the moon. And it basically then released something similar to a Mars rover onto the dark side of the moon. They landed it, and they need the orbiting satellite in order to relay commands and information coming from the dark side of the moon, because it has to rotate back to the side of the moon that faces the Earth. So it's able to take commands, go around the moon, give commands, take information, and then relay that information back. But they have been on the dark side of the moon, I can't remember exactly how long, but I think it's been at least 2 years. They released a few pictures at the very beginning of their mission of the lander, the rover getting off and going off onto the surface of the moon. And after that, absolutely nothing. And, people will say, well, none of this is real. It's all done in Hollywood studios, and it means nothing. But the one thing about moon landing, and I know this is going to be quite controversial, is the sense that the Japanese also have JAXA. JAXA is the Japanese space program. They also have a satellite orbiting the moon. And they have taken HD photographs of what we are told are the different Apollo landing sites, beginning with the Apollo 11. But what is weird about the Chinese mission there is not only the secrecy, but the lack of interest, especially from other spacefaring countries. That China, it's almost as though they're looking for something on the dark side of the moon. Now, I should express there are very, very weird features about the moon. Now, one of those was understood after the arrival of the Apollo 11 mission in July 1969 with Michael Collins as the orbital commander, while Buzz Aldrin and Neil Armstrong landed in the Eagle, the descent module. And what they did is after they had set up reflectors that NASA uses to send lasers to the moon to judge the distance to the millimeter of the moon to the Earth. But also, one of the things they did is as they went to return to Columbia, which was at the time controlled by Michael Collins, they had the descent module, they ejected part of it back into the moon, but they had already set up seismic instruments on the surface of the moon. And those seismic instruments, once hit by the descent module as it was ejected, as Armstrong and Aldrin made their way back to the Columbia, the moon rang like a bell for hours, which would suggest that large parts of the moon are not solid but hollow. And there's so many different things. Is that, for example, when the moon when we go into a solar eclipse and the moon travels in front of the sun, and I've actually had the good fortune of seeing one of those in my life, it is exactly the same size as the sun. And now for that to happen, it has to be exact same distance from the Earth, proportional to the size of the sun, which is much larger but much further. There are so many different things about the moon that raise speculation that not only is it anomalous, but many would then... There's a lot of conjecture that the moon is actually not a natural satellite, but it perhaps an artificial satellite. Another thing about the moon that is just absolutely bizarre is that... Well, I mean, I could go on forever on this. Well, another thing about the moon that's really bizarre is the fact that the isotopes of moon rocks don't correspond with those on planet Earth. So there's speculation that in 5 billion years ago something hit the Earth, knocked a piece of the Earth out, and it congealed and formed the moon, which is not actually, you can't confirm that at all with any of the moon rocks and the moon. But the fact that the moon, if you take a look at the size of the moon in comparison to any of the other orbital moons around the solar system, whether you look at Saturn, Jupiter, Mars, or any of the other planets that we are aware of moons and we know the sizes of them, you wouldn't even call the moon a moon. Most would then call it, we're in a binary system, just given the size of the moon and its proximity to our planet. And another thing would be, is if it wasn't created from our planet through an impact event, there would be absolutely no way for our moon to be captured by the gravity of our planet. It's just not strong enough for something of that size. And the other weird thing is that, getting back to the very beginning of this sort of conversation about China on the moon, is that there is a dark side of the moon. Now, most people will probably just think of Pink Floyd and their album, The Dark Side of the Moon, but the fact is that the moon does not rotate at all. It only shows one face to our planet at all times. And it was not until the Apollo missions of, I can't remember whether it was Apollo 8 or Apollo 9, when I believe the commander's name was Jim Lovell, and he went around the moon for the first time, that human beings actually were able to see what was on the other side. And the other side is heavily cratered. It doesn't look like anything like that we see in the moon in the night sky. The moon in the night sky, for example, where Aldrin and Armstrong landed, was called the Sea of Tranquility. And the reason is there's large, what they now claim to be lava plains on a dead planet. I don't really know how... I mean, we're talking, if these were actually created, it would be billions and billions of years ago, when the moon still had some kind of core, which it doesn't. But lava plains on one side, where the other side of the moon is heavily cratered with... The whole dark side of the moon is just one gigantic field of craters, where obviously our side is as well, but not anywhere near what you'd see on the dark side of the moon.
Is that to be expected owing to its proximity to outer space?
Well, the proximity, maybe. I mean, people would then say, the dark side of the moon would then be taking the asteroid impacts that were meant for Earth, and that in a way it's kind of an Earth defender. So it's taking the hits that our planet might have taken if we had not had such a massive satellite with its own gravity to attract what might have hit our planet. And that's why it would be hit that way. But then a lot of people would then say the planet Jupiter is also a massive guardian of our planet for even larger, faster, and more dangerous objects, not only coming from things like the asteroid belt, but interstellar. So, I mean... It's not only that it's too big to be a moon. It's not only that it doesn't rotate. It's not only that it seems to be hollow, at least seismically. It's not that it's perfectly the same size as our sun relative to the distance from our planet. There's so many anomalous parts of it, but then you can just add in the fact that it is our planet's guardian.
You were also telling me that there seems to be some evidence of potential tunnels that the Japanese have seen, is that correct?
Well, yeah, no, the Japanese, they haven't seen tunnels. So the the whole idea of creating moon bases is predicated on the idea that these moon bases would then have to be protected from not only meteor showers, but even micrometeor showers, and that any long-term or permanent human settlement on the moon would have to be under the surface in order to protect it from interstellar debris. And what I was saying previously about the Japanese and how they have a satellite, not satellites plural, a satellite orbiting the moon right now, they have found large cavernous tunnels under the surface of the moon, and it's pretty easy to find. If anyone's interested, just look up JAXA, JAXA, and this is the Japanese space program. It's basically just NASA, but in Japan, and the Japanese put up a lot of stuff. People don't realize it, probably now more than NASA does, actually. NASA's almost become since the end of the space shuttle era, it's almost become a defunct agency in certain respects. I mean, they can't even put a man in orbit, low Earth orbit.
Does NASA in charge of the Hubble, or is that a completely
yeah, it is. But the thing is that
the only...
without the space shuttle, though, they're not going to be able to service the Hubble, and its lifespan. Well, its lifespan with the shuttle program was greatly extended, but with the end of the space shuttle program, the next large mishap on the Hubble space program, the Space Telescope program, will signal its end. But I didn't finish the thing about tunnels. Is that they found kilometers long tunnels, half-kilometer wide tunnels under the surface of the moon, and they don't really understand how they're there, but they have suggested that these are lava chutes from 5 billion years ago. And again, magma lava chutes on a dead moon does sound a little bit... If you're not really paying attention, it sounds, okay, that makes a lot of sense. But if you're looking at a dead moon, I guess maybe, there could have been seismic activity 6 billion years ago, but there's a lot of things that don't add up. Let's just put it that way.
So to a normie like me who finds this fascinating, but it isn't necessarily primed to really comprehend the science behind it, this is ultimately the idea that the moon, of course,
this is the whole point. If it was knocked out of our planet, the idea of it having a molten core that then would create tectonic pressures that would then create lava chutes, just from a geological point of view, as far as I understand, doesn't make any sense. It's just not possible. And if it was some kind of dead rock that was just floating around, that literally could not have been picked up by Earth's gravity, given the size. As I said previously, nobody who would look at our relationship to the moon would call us a planet and its moon. They would call us a binary system. That the idea that this is at all possible, almost just from common sense, doesn't make any sense.
And yet it occupies a foundational role, almost perfect, regulating our tides, for example.
Well, no, I mean, the thing is the moon is necessary for so many functions of this planet, and this gets back to the idea that it might not be a natural satellite, and it might be a natural satellite, but then the question is who put it there? Because without it, it's not only the tides, there's so many different aspects to the power that the luna, the moon, has over our planet, not only in things that we're beginning to understand, like migratory birds, the movements of large mammals in the ocean. There are so many things and so many aspects of our planet that are regulated by the moon, that without the moon, it almost seems impossible for life as we know it to have ever taken hold, if you believe in the Big Bang and the whole scientific outlook on our planet. It almost seems impossible that life could have taken hold on this planet without the moon. So it's kind of almost now a chicken and an egg.
So really, would the argument that you're getting at be one of design?
Well, this
self-conscious
is
design.
Well, yes, just consciousness and design, and this gets into other aspects of things I've talked about on my channel about the peculiar nature of consciousness. and the idea that consciousness is not a creation of the material world, but the material world is a creation of consciousness. And that without consciousness, the material world would not have substance. Now, that's a very, very loaded couple of sentences, and what I would ask is when we're finished to you to put some links in the description of this video so people can watch some videos that I've made that are quite long and very detailed in explaining what I actually mean on this, because this is something that takes a long time to actually put your head around, but it's not something that is out of the realms of current understandings, scientific understanding, especially when you get into quantum mechanics and its effect on things like light, things like on perception, and ultimately consciousness, which is something I should suggest and suggest very, very strongly, that there is absolutely no consensus on what consciousness is, and especially on how consciousness is created.
Well, what would you say to the philosophical argument of Descartes, which is, I think, therefore I am? Is that ultimately what your premise can be summarized as?
No.
That the material world is a consequence of consciousness, is that?
Well, yes. The material world is a consciousness.
As opposed to consciousness being secondary?
Well, yeah, exactly. So current scientific orthodoxy perceives the universe as being this material expanse of rocky planets or comets and stars, and it's just all sitting there, and it's just there, and then boom, one day there are sentient creatures that can then contemplate it. And that is, in many ways, I would suggest people who would like not an overarching understanding of this, but there is an academic. His name is Dr. Robert Lanza, and he has a book called Biocentrism, and that book kind of delineates his perspective on not consciousness itself, but on the primacy of biology over materialism. Consciousness is a necessary component for reality, and without consciousness, reality would not exist in the form that we perceive it to be. And this is not to say that human consciousness is the only consciousness, because you can go down to squirrels, and squirrels have a consciousness. They have, whether it be more limited than ours, it doesn't mean that their consciousness is any less valuable or intrinsically worthless. I'll give an example of this. If you sit down and you've got a Dalmatian, you got a Rottweiler, you got a boxer, you got a golden retriever, and you say, let's say the dog's name is Joe, and you say, hey Joe, go get me my slippers. Joe will go get you your slippers. And if you say, Joe, give me a handshake, Joe will give you a handshake. If you say, Joe, give me a kiss, he'll lick your face. You say, Joe, sit. Joe will sit. Roll over. But then I say to Joe, can you give me some sort of answer to this calculus problem I'm having right here? Joe's going to look at you dumbfounded, and he's going to say, well, do you want a kiss or do you want your slippers? But he's not capable with his consciousness to understand certain things like calculus. And I think that is the consciousness trap that we as humans are in. We are also we are limited by our biology and by our ability to understand consciousness and its greater meaning within the universe that we inhabit. So we can try to understand it. I think human beings have tried to understand it as God, and we've tried to understand it as the spiritual world, and I think that there's a lot of evidence that, and growing body of evidence, that these beliefs not only create the bonds that are necessary for civilizations all the way down to the tribal level to exist and continue, but they are necessary for us and pretty much hardwired into us as a being. I believe that you will never find any human society that gave up belief in the spiritual and lasted for very long. Just to finish up on consciousness, is that we as human beings are conscious, but I don't believe that we have the biological ability in what we are currently evolved as to actually understand the big questions. Why am I here? What is the purpose of my life? And where am I going? Mm-hmm. And what happens to me? The biggest question is, what happens to me when I die? And I don't think that there are many answers to that, but I think that one of the answers is that consciousness is not something that is created, nor can it be destroyed. The only other example I'll get, and I'll move away from this, is that try to imagine us as try to imagine a radio. So you turn on the radio and you start listening to whomever is the talk show host or music or whatnot. But now, because we understand radio waves, nobody's going to believe that the radio is actually the source of those voices or that music. Those voices and those music, that music is coming from, it's being transmitted across the airwaves. It's not the physical plastic metal machine that's creating these signals, but it's receiving them. And I would then postulate that perhaps we are something similar to radios. We are receiving signals of consciousness, and it allows us to interpret the reality around us. But without that consciousness, I don't believe there would just be this cold, empty, lifeless universe, because there would be no point for it to exist in any rational way. And just something as simple as putting your finger against a lit candle and the pain that it causes your finger, and all of the things that have to have occurred over 6 billion years to create something like a nervous system, DNA, and all of the other accoutrements of what creates you as a human being. But then all of that being trumped by consciousness is something that I think a lot of people don't consider. And I think consciousness is primacy. Actually, I think consciousness is absolute primacy.
That reminds me of something that Bob Lazar said. Bob Lazar being, for those who aren't familiar, an engineer who claims in the 70s to have worked at Area 51, where he had been asked ostensibly to reverse engineer the technology on a spacecraft. He likened it to dropping a nuclear reactor into a room of Victorian engineers and asking them to determine how it works. But of course, the Victorians had no reference point for radiation at that time. Is that a fair comparison or metaphor?
I think it's a very fair comparison, and I think it's pretty much accurate. And I would suggest that Bob Lazar, who had been ridiculed since the 1980s for being a crank and a charlatan, has been vindicated in several different ways over the last 10 years. But yeah, I would say that that's a very good metaphor to describe what I'm talking about, is that we don't have the contextual milestones or points of reference to understand a lot of what is happening around us, because we're almost like and I'm going to use it's not a quote, but something that Graham Hancock has said very often in his serialization of things going all the way back. So we're doing a full circle here with Graham Hancock, and he says that he believes that we are a species with amnesia. So I'm attributing that to Graham Hancock. That's not my saying, but he believes that we are a species with amnesia. And I would say that I think that that's probably one of the best ways to explain our current inability to understand almost anything around us. We seem to be a species that is completely lost and punching in the dark and almost blind to absolutely everything around us. And one of the things that I think that every person could get behind is that the kind of damage that we're doing to our environment right now, the kind of damage that we're doing to ourselves with things like microplastics, with other things that aren't really allowed to be spoken about anymore on social media. There's a lot of those sort of things that we're not allowed to talk about, but there's a lot of things that I think people could rally around and agree with, no matter your political persuasion. Doesn't matter where you are on the political compass, that we are almost and I can't even, I've got to be very careful in the words I use because I don't want to trigger anything, but we are a species and a people that we're lost in certain respects. We're not only lost in where we are as a people today, where we come from, who we are, why we are, why we do what we do, but also especially, what are we? And I think that's the big question. What are we? Where do we come from? And where do we go after we die?
Do you think there's something to be said for getting to a point where one is simply at ease with that chaos? I guess I had in mind Nietzsche's idea of amour fati, love of one's fate. Is there something to be said for being at ease with the not knowing, to be content with the unanswered?
Well, yes, actually, I do. And I think that once you understand that whether light is a wave or a particle, whether the world is real or a simulation, whether any of it even matters, you are living it, and that is the most important thing. You're experiencing it, and you're not going to be experiencing it forever. Now, there's a church in Rome that I've made t-shirts actually about, and in that church they have the skulls of previous priests and friars that had been part of that particular denomination and that church. And just to make it very quickly, what they did is they would take the skulls and the bones of these priests multiple years after they had died. They would wash them, and they make art out of their bones. And what they said was that it's called memento mori, always remember death. And I remember reading something that said that, look at us, we were once like you, and one day you will be like us. Memento mori, always remember death.
Those words are on the grave of one of our former poet laureates, Thomas Gray. He has this epitaph, "The paths of glory lead but to the grave."
I like that very much. Can you just repeat that again for the viewers? The path to glory leads to the grave?
The paths of glory lead but to the grave, yeah.
That's a great saying. I would like... That's something I'd like to put on my tombstone.
I'll send you the link to it. It's a gorgeous, very moving poem. Similar to an old English idiom, gather your rosebuds while you may.
Maybe you should leave that in the description as well. Now, to get back to the other part of that question, yeah, absolutely. I think to understand that we're living in a very chaotic reality that it's almost impossible for us to understand. I can just give one anecdote from my own life, is that when I was a boy, I had a Dalmatian dog, and that Dalmatian dog, well, two things. Dalmatians are not very clever. Let's just be honest. They're not a clever breed of dogs, and they also fart a lot. So this dog liked to just leave the worst farts possibly imaginable, and then he would run out of the room after he just let off a stink bomb, and I think he enjoyed doing it. And that was something that I remember as a kid. But then a couple of years ago, I went to Croatia, and I didn't even realize it. I was in Dalmatia, and Dalmatia was the place I went to, just to put it into context, was a city called Split that had grown around, in the medieval times, around what was the palace of the last singular Roman emperor, Diocletian. And he was a guy that just didn't want to rule anymore. And he was the last singular ruler of the Roman Empire. And he split Rome into two, with a ruler in the east and a ruler in the west. And that's not really consequential to the story. But the thing is that I started to realize that all of these things that we understand as being important or not important or part of the reality we're in, a lot of it really doesn't matter, because for me, a Dalmatian will always be a dog that's kind of stupid and likes to fart. It's not this place that you go to for Roman imperial history. So it doesn't matter in certain respects. So getting back to your question, yeah, there is a certain calmness and a certain semblance of I guess, peace in understanding that you won't understand. I think I can't remember who it was. It might have been Pericles or somebody from ancient Athens who, he said the only thing a wise man understands is that he doesn't understand everything. It's better to listen than to talk. It's better to absorb than try to postulate and promulgate. So, yeah, I would agree with you. There is a certain sense of calm and a certain sense of tranquility to just let the world wash over you.
Well, I think that leads us to our summarising question. If the paths of glory lead but to the grave, then why does Hollow Moon matter? Why should we be interested? Why did we get excited to talk about it? And should anyone really care?
Yeah, they should. Because the one thing about this life, and I think it's beaten out of us as children. But as children, and being children, and we've all been children, is that this world is magical when we're young. There's a Erasure song that I like. Erasure's a 1990s band, I think. Can't remember exactly what the name of the song, but I remember there were certain lyrics in the song as I'd like to be a child again, so many things to do, playground noise and colored toys, and everything brand new. And I think it's kind of poignant in that sense, is that when you're a child, even things like playgrounds are not just there for you to have fun, but they're there for you to understand how your body works, how gravity works, how to manipulate the environment in which you live. And why things like, for example, the hollow moon matter, or tic-tacs, or pyramid building, or all of these sort of things, is that I think that the older that we get, and the further away we become from children, as we start to lose the magic of the reality that we're ensconced in. And I think that once you're able to reconnect with the magic of life, the magic of consciousness, the magic of reality, that your life will be inordinately placed on a better path. And it doesn't matter what your magic is. So we could go to pyramid building, we can go to tic-tacs, we can go to the moon, we can go into supernatural psychedelic experiences, we can go into a multitude of different avenues in which the magic of our reality is expressed in certain ways. But I think that why it's important is because we do live in a reality that is magical. And I think the problem is the older we get, the more trials and turbulation, the more stress, the more obstacles, the more things put into our path. And unfortunately, that is, I think, quite... Almost everybody can I think, agree that we deal with adversity almost every single day. But that adversity takes us further and further and further away from remembering the magical aspects of our consciousness and our reality and the
unknown.
Yeah, and that's why I think that everything we spoke about today actually does matter. It matters because it gives our lives not only meaning, but it gives our lives magic.
Wonder and awe, as one has as a child.
Yeah, wonder and awe.
Well, I'd say that's certainly something valuable to re-inject society with.
I would agree, and I think it's something not only that begins with the individual, that then translates to the community. And I think that the problem is that within our current situation, our communities have been deracinated to the point where people can't even talk to each other, and this is something tragic, but something that can be healed at least individually, then within small groups, and then as those groups form with other groups, they can be translated to larger communities.
Well, Black Pigeon Speaks, should we wrap it up there? Would you like to end it there?
I think we've kind of gone through a lot of the sort of substance of our conversation, and I think that's a great place to end. So thank you very much for having me. I very much appreciate being given the opportunity.
Well, it's been a pleasure to speak with you. So yeah, space and shit, right?
Space and shit.